We're live?
We're going live now.
Excellent, so I can begin. Good morning. On behalf of the Free Library of Philadelphia, my name is Dr. Guy Sims. I'm the Chief Diversity Officer of the Free Library here. And I would like to welcome everyone to what should be an engaging and poignant conversation on recent actions taken by the works of our beloved author and illustrator, Dr. Seuss. The topic itself expands beyond the 6 books in question, but raises a conversation around issues of censorship, cancel culture, racism, and especially what libraries should do with the materials already in its possession. Just to give a little quick background for the 1 or 2 of us who aren't sure of what's going on March 2nd of this year, the Dr. Seuss estate announced that it would stop selling 6 of the children's author's 60 titles, saying the books contain racial and ethnic stereotypes that are, as they say, hurtful and wrong. And those books are, if you're not familiar, and to think that I saw it on Mulberry Street, If I Ran the Zoo, McElligot's Pool, On Beyond Zebra, Scrambled Eggs Super, and The Cat's Quizzer. So today we have an esteemed panel to guide our conversation, so please allow me to introduce. And as I say your name, just wave your hand so people know who you are. We have Pat Scales. She's a librarian, journalist, past president of the Association of Library Services for Children, and author of many publications about banned and challenged children literature. Second up, we have Dr. Michelle Martin, a Beverly Cleary professor for Children and Youth Services at the University of Washington, whose academic background focuses on diversity in children's literature. And to round out the panel, Dr. Philip Nell, professor at Kansas State University, and a scholar who has addressed Dr. Seuss's works in his publications. So before we begin, I would like to ask everyone that if you find your microphone is on, it's always just good to know, just please mute it. Secondly, we welcome your questions and comments. Please add them to the Q&A feature, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. So with that, I would like to thank Christopher Brown, and wave your hand, Chris. He's the curator of the Children's Literature Research Collection at the Free Library for organizing this event. And so with that, let's begin with some opening comments from Chris.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sims. And thank you all for joining us this morning for what I know will be a very lively discussion. This panel is taking place on April 7th, 2021 for the staff of the Free Library of Philadelphia. The panelist talks and moderated discussion will later be added to the Special Collections YouTube page for repeat viewings and for interested members of the public. The final part of today's webinar will be for staff only, so that Free Library workers have a digital safe space to ask questions, share viewpoints, and continue our collective professional development. Before we start, I'd like to quickly mention the Children's Literature Research Collection at the Free Library of Philadelphia, which we affectionately call CLRC. CLRC promotes the history, study, and development of children's literature, and the collection houses a repository of over 85,000 works of children's literature and an archive of original artwork, manuscripts, ephemera, and just plain weird stuff. If you're searching for books in our electronic catalog at freelibrary.org, you'll only find about 50% of the titles in the repository. Most of the other half is cataloged on physical cards only. And if you're a younger person watching this, please ask a trusted elder what a card catalog is, and oh, you'll laugh. It'll be so much fun. We have 2 very hardworking catalogers who are helping us add those titles into the electronic catalog. But with approximately 40,000 plus titles, this is a very long-term project. If you'd like to know if we have a specific book, or if you have questions about the collection, please email us at clrc@freelibrary.org. If you're watching us on YouTube, there's more information about the collection, including our contact information and information about our panelists in the info bar below. While you're down there, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. This YouTube channel was started by our rare book department, but it features information and programs from across all of the special collections at the Free Library of Philadelphia, and we're adding new information all the time. During the conversation today, we may discuss things that make you feel uncomfortable. It may seem even more difficult when we're talking about fondly remembered books from childhood. Discovering new information and listening to new points of view can make us feel overwhelmed, anxious, or uncomfortable. That's part of the learning process. It's okay to use those feelings to further guide your own educational experience, but we cannot use those feelings as justification for us responding aggressively to others. Now, that being said, let's jump in, and I'm going to turn things over to Pat Scales. Pat, the word censorship has been thrown around a lot by commentators discussing Seuss Enterprises' decision to stop publishing these 6 titles. Can you tell us what is censorship and what's going on with that in that situation?
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen right now because in order to keep this moving kind of rapidly here. Um, First of all, we all know that the freedom to read is grounded in the First Amendment, and it is supported and promoted by the American Library Association. In fact, ALA's Office of Intellectual Freedom was actually established to guide libraries as they deal with issues related to intellectual freedom. And this includes right now, at this present moment, helping librarians and the public understand what Seuss Enterprises has done. First of all, what a lot of people are surprised about, many of you won't be, those of you who have been to library school, certainly, hopefully, but private, government-owned and government-funded institutions like public schools, public libraries, and universities are considered state actors, and therefore they're controlled by the First Amendment. Private schools, universities, and libraries are not controlled by the First Amendment. And I've had a lot of questions from private schools over the years, and they're always surprised to learn that they're not protected by the First Amendment. But it doesn't mean private institutions and universities and so forth might not write, they could write into their mission statement that they support the First Amendment and give their patrons and their staff those rights. But let's be clear, people scream censorship and cancel culture when it's politically advantageous to them. And I think that's exactly what's just happened. Using the big C word or censorship word in reaction to Seuss Enterprises has only made politicians and many in the general public look incredibly ignorant about what censorship is and what it is not. It doesn't really matter their reason, Seuss Enterprises' reason, but they should be applauded for their reevaluation of titles that may be harmful and hurtful to children we serve. Seuss, they did make a statement that clearly states a commitment to accurately portray all communities and families we serve. I mean, they serve through their books, and I think they should be applauded, actually. Now, that said, you may say, well, how does ALA feel about this? Well, first of all, one of the core values of librarianship includes intellectual freedom and social justice. We are committed to both things, and at times it may appear that these things collide, but not really if you really analyze it. For instance, intellectual freedom is at work here today because we're freely exchanging ideas and information so that we might better serve our students and our patrons and make better decisions in collection development. But public institutions, and the American Library Association makes loud statements about this, must reflect the diverse communities in which we live and work. That said, an institution may keep these 6 Seuss titles in circulation and choose not to display them. My cell phone, I should have, I forgot my iPad was in the room with me. I'm very sorry. That said, an institution may keep these 6 Seuss titles in circulation and choose not to display them or use them in story time. In this way, young patrons and their caregivers can make their own decision whether to read the books or not. I understand, for instance, that the Chicago Public Library has removed the books from circulation while they decide what to do. New York Public has left them in circulation while they make a decision. Some institutions have simply chosen to move them to an archive where they are still available, but are just not on the general shelves. These decisions must all be grounded in policy. And that's the key word, your collection development policy. And in that is the reconsideration policy, weeding or deselecting policy. All actions we take, it doesn't matter what we do, must be grounded in this policy. So that you need to make sure you know clearly what your institution's collection development policy is. If your policy states that the library staff regularly assesses the collection to keep it up to date, then you should proceed with an assessment of all of these Dr. Seuss titles. We wouldn't think twice, for instance, about deselecting outdated nonfiction titles, especially in science and social studies. So why not reconsider fiction that's outdated and is no longer relevant or has appeal to the children we serve? Now, most of you understand what collection development policy should be, but when you are deselecting, in my day it was called weeding, now it's called deselecting, you must always consider accuracy, currency, relevancy, content, and usage. That said, I would say the Dr. Seuss books should be moved on. What is censorship? Censorship has occurred when the removal of library materials the removal of library materials without due process, altering illustrations, and I'll explain that in a minute, and failure to select resources merely because they may be controversial, or withdrawing resources for the same reason. Policy keeps the process of selecting books and deselecting books objective and should be followed precisely. Some public libraries place the final decision on the director. That is a burden to carry, I would think, but decisions should rest with committees, establish guidelines, and taken to the board of directors or school boards, and if that happens. Altering illustrations, and the reason I put this in here is most people do not understand what I mean when I talk about this, but I recently had a question for my School Library Journal column from a teacher that says that she uses these books, but what she does is just takes a magic marker and alters the illustrations. Well, in a lot of states, that is a misdemeanor when you alter the illustrations. The only people that have the authority to alter anything within a book is the copyright owner. So please do not make your student ever allow people to think that is okay to alter those illustrations. Also, kids will, that's sending a huge message to kids. Actually, this is not the first time. I mean, altering illustrations has happened many times by copyright owners. Seuss himself did it with And to Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street when it was reissued in 1978. And it was originally published in 1937, I believe. And he removed the pigtail from the Chinese man, and he edited the text and took out Chinaman and put in Chinese man. The D'Orleans, Abraham Lincoln, has been altered from the original, and by the 75th anniversary edition, they had completely digitally altered the illustrations to be more sensitive, culturally sensitive. Now, oh, I'm sorry. It's important to know, okay, let me just say this. Every day there's a book challenged, removed, banned, or censored somewhere in the US. Now, it's important to know the difference in challenged, removed, and banned, and censored. And that's a discussion we can have much later on because it's kind of involved, gets a little bit deeper into all of these issues. But we have to be aware that this is happening on a daily basis. But it's important to, the 2020, by the way, the 2020 top 10 most challenged book list has just been released. And 8 of the 10 books deal with issues related to race and social justice topics. such as police brutality. So we have a lot of work to do, and the Office of Intellectual Freedom is working with that on a daily basis. Seuss Enterprises isn't guilty of censorship. They are a private company. It was a business decision. They can do as they want. It's not the first time this has happened. Just several years ago with the birthday cake for George Washington, Scholastic took it out of publication within about 2 weeks of publication. So companies have that decision. They're privately owned, and they can do what they want. So Seuss Enterprises is not guilty of censorship, but public institutions may be guilty if they fail to objectively follow policy as they grapple with this important issue. Thank you, and I'll address questions later.
Thank you so much, Pat. That was very enlightening. Philip, I'm going to turn to you and ask, you've written so much about Dr. Seuss in your professional career. Can you tell us a little bit about Theodore Geisel and help us understand his life, his points of view, his books, and so on?
Yes, glad to. And let me share also my screen, which in the beginning here overlaps slightly with Pat, but as you all know from the introduction, last month Dr. Seuss Enterprises stopped publication of these 6 books, but they're not. This isn't canceling anything. Those who speak of cancel culture speak of the decision as if it's an act of censorship or the books are being banned, but the books aren't being censored. They aren't being banned. It's not illegal to read these 6 books or to own these 6 books. I own all 6, and I have spoken of them very publicly on television, sometimes holding books up to the screen, and no government agent has yet appeared at my door demanding that I surrender my copies. And Pat has done a wonderful discussion of the library's role here, but you know, these books are in many, many libraries still today. They haven't been taken out. And there are still lots and lots of other Seuss books that are not on that list and that are being published. And a question that the cancel culture, professional grievance actors never address is, can culture cause damage or pain? And what specifically are you defending in this culture? Indeed, if it were possible to cancel culture, are there perhaps some cultures we might want to cancel? I don't know, rape culture maybe, or white supremacist culture? Because, you know, when you grow up in a white supremacist culture, some of that will rub off on you. From Dr. Seuss's earliest cartoons in the 1920s, from before he even adopted Dr. Seuss as his pen name, racist caricature recurs in his work. In fact, even before Seuss published any cartoons at all, he, as a high school student, wrote a blackface minstrel show and performed in that show in blackface. So it is not completely surprising that racist images should appear in his cartoons and then later in his picture books. Now, people will defend Dr. Seuss, who was born in 1904, as a man of his time. And they'll say, don't impose modern day political correctness on him. That's how they thought back then. But who is this they? All people, everywhere? All white people? At all times and in all places, all people did not think alike. And you can test this thesis right now. Do all people think alike today in 2021? The "they thought that way then" claim presents past racism as inevitable. But racism is not inevitable. As Robin Bernstein notes, in the United States, the range of racial beliefs has changed relatively little from the 19th century to the present. The proportion of people who think particular thoughts has changed, but the array of thinkable thoughts has not changed. In the past and in the present, both ordinary and extraordinary people have opposed white supremacy. Both remarkable and unremarkable people have supported white supremacy. In the same period that these withdrawn Seuss books were published, we can find quite different portraits of people of African descent in the children's books of Langston Hughes and Arnabon Tomps, and in North Star Shining, a pictorial history of the American Negro by white American authors Hildegard Hoyt Swift and Lynn Ward, published 3 years before Dr. Seuss's If I Ran the Zoo, the caricature of which is so egregious that one reporter I showed it to asked me, quote, "How do you know they're not supposed to be monkeys?" As I told her, I know because they look just like other Africans in Seuss's earlier cartoons. Now, people will correctly point out that Seuss also did anti-racist work, and that's true. In a 1952 essay, Seuss pointedly critiques racist humor. Inspired by his opposition to anti-Semitism, Seuss wrote The Sneetches, the first version of which appeared in 1953. In 1954, Seuss's Horton Hears a Who presents the Who's smallness as an arbitrary mark of difference for which they are unfairly penalized. One review at the time said that Horton's refrain, a person's a person, no matter how small, was, quote, a rhymed lesson in protection of minorities and their rights. But in the same decade that Seuss is writing these books, he's also writing If I Ran the Zoo with its visits to the African island of Yerka and the, quote, mountains of Zomba Matant with helpers who all wear their eyes at a slant. 3 years later in Scrambled Egg Super, he invites us to laugh at Ali, a gullible Arab, being attacked by hundreds of very angry birds. Seuss is recycling racist caricature at the same time that he is in other works striving to oppose racist ways of thinking. And this can be confusing to people, I think. And I think it's often confusing to people because people tend to think of racism as an either or. You're either on team racism or you're on team anti-racism. But racism is not an either or. It's a both and. Starting in childhood, we absorb racist images and ideas without our knowledge and without our consent. And Seuss was not aware of how thoroughly his own imagination was steeped in a white supremacist culture. And so he does both racist and anti-racist work at the same time, as you see in these two cartoons, which were published 4 months apart. But my awareness of how my own imagination is steeped in a white supremacist culture is only partial too. While preparing to teach the book in a graduate class on 20th century picture books, I picked up Helen Bannerman's Little Black Sambo for the first time. And as I read it, I realized I already knew it. Had I read her version? Or maybe a later edition with even more grotesque racist caricature? I didn't know then, and I don't know now, but I wondered, what other half-remembered stories with or without such character lurk in my own subconscious. You know, people will say that, well, Seuss didn't really intend racism with these drawings, and his anti-racist works prove that. And I don't know that he saw these images as harmful, and I don't actually think he intended harm, but racism does not depend upon perception or intent. It's very easy to participate in white supremacist culture without awareness or even active malice. And here I'd indict myself too. On the morning of March 2nd, I heard that Seuss Enterprises was withdrawing these 6 books via a text from my friend, Professor Sarah Park-Dallin. I immediately thought, okay, these 3 books definitely on the list, you know, for all the reasons we've just looked at. But then what are the other 3? Okay, McElligot's Pool, Cat's Quizzer. Well, Seuss often uses exoticism and foreignness as a punchline. Are there examples in these books? Oh, yeah, okay, right, the Eskimo fish and McElligot's Pool. And actually, Japanese is used as a punchline twice in Cat's Quizzer, okay. But On Beyond Zebra, well, that's a favorite book of mine. It's one of Seuss's most avant-garde books. invents an entirely new alphabet to describe all you can see if you don't stop at the letter Z. It reminds young readers that this language they're learning to read is arbitrary and slightly ridiculous. That's great. What could possibly be objectionable here? Well, in rereading the book, I see how this caricature of a Middle Eastern man is a caricature of a Middle Eastern man. I hadn't actually seen this as a caricature until Dr. Seuss Enterprises pointed it out. Now, I've written a lot about Dr. Seuss. I've written about blackface minstrelsy's influence on the Cat in the Hat. You'd think I would have noticed, but I hadn't. I didn't know what I didn't know. I didn't see what I didn't see. Any culture you grow up in seems natural, inevitable. When you grow up in a racist culture, you won't see all the racism. It's just part of the world in which you live. If you've only ever seen a polluted ocean, then that's what an ocean looks like. Only when somebody points out the pollution in the ocean or the racism in the culture do you notice, and then you begin to ask questions. So when you have children's books that perpetuate harm, you can teach against them. You can place racist books in the context of books that tell the truth, teaching people to read racist classics uncomfortably. This approach is not easy, and it places a far, far heavier burden on readers who are the targets of that caricature. But you can do it. You can also teach books that do not perpetuate harm, but instead present people of any heritage with respect. All children need to see themselves in the books they read. So nothing's being canceled. Dr. Seuss Enterprises has done a product recall. 6 products were defective. They stopped manufacturing them. And Dr. Seuss has not been canceled because cancel culture is not real. Cancel culture is a conspiracy theory amplifying adult nostalgia for an allegedly innocent childhood, a time when Dr. Seuss was not political. Life was simpler and America was great. This is what Svetlana Boym calls restorative nostalgia, a longing for a unified, uncomplicated past, a, quote, enchanted world with clear borders and values. However, as Boym warns, only false memories can be totally recalled. So what we instead need is what Boym calls reflective nostalgia, which dwells in memory's imperfections, exploring the ambivalence, the complexity, the pain that restorative nostalgia strives to erase. We must show people that deeply felt memories do not authorize indifference towards others and do not remove the need for reflection. We must ask, what if something we loved as children might cause harm today? Indeed, what if it caused harm then? In other words, we need to acknowledge pain. And so I'll conclude with James Baldwin's wise observation that, quote, one of the reasons that people cling to their hates so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with pain. And I would invite us all to deal with that pain. Thank you.
Philip, thank you so much. That was wonderful. Michelle, Pat has given us some framework and Philip has given us some context to understand these things. Can you walk us through how we use this now to evaluate children's literature today?
You're on mute, Michelle?
I think you're muted, unfortunately.
Okay, am I good now?
Yes,
Okay,
you're good.
thank you. Thank you so much, Pat, for that framing. Thank you so much, Phil, but I hate going after you because your slides are always so fabulous. And I love the picture that we're painting here of sort of what's happened and how you can think about it in ways that will help you move forward, because that's really what this is all about today, moving forward. I want to give you just a little bit of background and then talk a little bit about what you as library staff might want to be thinking about at this point in our collective history, given all that happened last summer, that's happening right now. In 1965, Nancy Larrick published a bellwether article that was called The All-White World of Children's Literature. And I hope that anybody who's been to library school, who has studied any of this stuff about youth services will recognize this. But it sounded the alarm and served as a wake-up call about all children who had been left out of the historical record of children's literature. After examining 5,206 children's books published between 1962 and 1964 by 63 publishers, Larrick determined that only 6.4% of those texts, 349 total, included Black characters in the illustrations, and 60% of these stories were set outside of the US or prior to World War II. So this was not a situation where kids were able to, go to the library and really check out books that represent them unless they were white. This is Rudine Sims Bishop. We owe her a lot in the scholarly pursuit of children's literature. She's emerita from the Ohio State University, and she wrote an article called Mirrors, Windows, and Sliding Glass Doors in the 80s that is still widely used and cited, oftentimes without acknowledging Dr. Bishop. But she really talked about mirrors, windows as those books that allow you to look into the life of someone who doesn't look and doesn't live like you. Maybe another country, maybe another ethnicity, maybe another religion. Mirrors are those that reflect your life. And then sliding glass doors are those immersive experiences that you read about and the world goes away. You just forget everything and you are immersed in that world. And this has been an important thing to think about as we think about for whom are there mirrors and for whom are there windows in our libraries, in our school libraries, on our bookshelves, in fact. And sort of jumping forward here, on March 15th, 2014, longtime children's and young adult author Walter Dean Myers, who was also a former Library of Congress ambassador for young people's literature, the position that Jason Reynolds holds now, and his son, author and artist Christopher Myers, published New York Times complimentary op-ed pieces posing the same question that Nancy Larrick was asking in 1965. Where are the people of color in children's literature and the apartheid of children's literature, respectively? And in those intervening 49 years between Larrick's and the Myers articles, though many wonderful books by minority authors and artists and about the experiences of non-white children were published, a great deal of ink had also been spilled over this issue because inequities still did and still do exist. According to the Pew Research Center, as of 2015, minority infants became the majority in the US, 50.2%, and the World Population Review predicts that by 2055, the racial makeup of the US will be 48% white, 24% Hispanic, 14% Asian, and 13% Black. And that really means that at this point, we are nowhere close to having the children's book industry keep up with the changing demographics of the US. And these statistics, I hope everyone has seen. There are two of them so far, and I think that this infographic is probably being redone now because we've got a few more years under our belt. So in 2015, Sarah Park Dahlen, the scholar who's pictured on the right, partnered with the Center for Children, the Cooperative Center for Children's Books at the University of Wisconsin, that keeps the statistics on diversity in children's literature, and decided to make it more accessible because very few people go there, and a lot of people don't necessarily look these statistics up on the web. But if you can see that in 2015, 73.3% of the books that were written portrayed white children. This is not about authorship, this particular infographic. So white children, vast majority, and then animals are next. So you got a better chance of seeing yourself in a children's book in 2015 if you're a bear or rabbit than if you are, say, a Native American child who has that, those little mirrors that the dentist uses to look back at your like molars. That's the kind of mirror that the Native American child and the Latinx child have. So take a look at this. And then 2018, you can see that the shift, yes, the white statistic went down, but they all moved over to the bears, right? And so, I don't know if this is because authors like, oh, well, I'm not sure how we're going to do this, but maybe animals are safer. Animals aren't always safer, though, because if you look at the work of name is escaping me at the second. It'll come back to me. But a librarian is doing some work on looking at simians, apes and monkeys in children's books. And oftentimes they're very thinly veiled and they look a bit, some not too unlike those ones that Seuss has portrayed. And a lot of things are happening that suggest that they may be, characters of color. And so Crazy Quilt Edie, Edie Campbell is the librarian scholar who's been doing that work. But anyway, so you can see that African-American went up a little bit. Asian-American went up, Asian Pacific Islander went up a bit. Still, the Native American is still down, really quite low. And so these statistics aren't moving nearly as fast as the demographics in the US are moving. And so this is something that you really need to attend to in terms of promoting the books that are there and that also are, here's the next piece, own voices. So if you think about who is writing the books, again, you had 73% in 2015. This is a 2017 infographic that 61% of the US population was white, but 85.8% of the books were written by white writers. And so you can see how, again, it's not really matching the population of the US, and the fact that, and multi-ethnic is quite low because that statistic just started getting tracked. But I think that will grow with time. But anyway, so a lot of work to do in terms of the industry of children's literature. And I wanted to just mention that, let's see. Okay, that slide didn't come out. I had an infographic here of Patricia Montiel overall created, wrote an article called Cultural Competence, a conceptual framework for library and information science professionals. Actually, let me unshare and pull that slide up so that you can actually see it. It's pretty important. And what she talks about is if you are sort of starting from scratch in terms of if you, for instance, want to share an African-American story in story time, she talks about, what you need to do to prepare yourself. And it's not necessarily good enough just to say, oh, I'll read it and sort of see what happens. So she talks about starting with cultural incapacity. And that's really those Latinx boys in my library, they're loud and I don't know how to communicate with them. And I can't deal with them. Cultural blindness is I don't see race. That's a problem because scientists have found that even at 6 months old, children are already identifying with those who look like them, the caregivers who have been taking care of them, that they have sort of a preference for those who look like them. So don't even go there with cultural blindness because it doesn't really exist. It's just a smoke screen. Lack of cultural competence is, I don't really know a whole lot about this culture, but I'm open. And then some are limited. You started learning, and she lists ways that you can gain more cultural competence. Travel, I think, is an excellent way, especially if you can travel and visit people who you know there, not just as a tourist. Reading, education, and I loved reading children's books that helped me get to know a culture. Cultural and self-reflection and cultural proficiency is, I really feel like you only get to cultural proficiency either if you've spent a lifetime working on becoming culturally proficient in that culture, or if you are from that culture. And sometimes that's not even a guarantee. We have lots of cross-racial and international adoption. So sometimes the culture that you are isn't the culture that you grow up in. Or sometimes, sometimes my friends tease me, I'm still earning my Black card. Sometimes I feel culturally incompetent when I'm around some other African Americans. And so it's really a process of learning. But I also can't emphasize enough this part right here at the beginning: cultural self-reflection and reflection of other cultures. That inward gazing piece, you've got to be willing to go there. In the same way that Phil showed that picture of him and the gollywog and saying, I also didn't see, one of the racist caricatures in this Seuss book, even though I had been studying this for a long time. You have to be willing to go there and say, wow, I still got some blinders on myself, right? I grew up, Pat is in South Carolina. I grew up in South Carolina, and I know that some of the things in terms of my lens of how I look at things are really grounded in the South, and having grown up with parents who drank out of for coloreds only water fountains. And so when I start interacting with people who are not from my background, I really have to think about that. One last slide, and then I'm going to back out. So this is one that she talks about where it's sort of 3 different realms of cultural competence. Cognitive, that's your inward gazing. Interpersonal, how you interact with other people and how all of these things impact your interaction with other people. And then environmental, when people walk into your library, do they feel welcome? Are there books face front? You know, cereal boxes are always face front in the grocery store. You never see spines of cereal boxes, right? Because that's what attracts you. So are those books that are about, you know, the Eritreans who live in your community? Are they out so that people can see them and enjoy them and realize, oh, they want me here, right? So what does the environment, and that might be about mobility, it might be about making a place in your library for kids who are autistic. It might be about, you know, not having a policy in your library that they'll throw you out if you're sleeping. We have lots of people who are unhoused in Seattle, and that is an issue that has come up a lot. So these are some things from Patricia Montiel overall's cultural competence. Cultural humility is also, you know, the approach that I need to be able to acknowledge that I don't know everything, and I need to be able to see what I don't know, right? Okay, I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating to hear and listen to. I'd like to open up a question for panelists and questions for everyone. But Pat, I'm going to put you in the hot seat initially and say that you write a bi-monthly column for School Library Journal called Scales on Censorship. It's a great column. I highly recommend it to library workers who are with us today. In March 2019, your column addressed a line between sensitivity and censorship in regard to small and inaccurate depictions, and really well thought out. My question is, for everyone, is there such a thing as a small stereotypical depiction? And if so, how do library workers evaluate its effect on an overall book?
Pat, you're muted. Are you answering? I think you were supposed to go first, but you seem to be muted.
Oh, Pat, you muted again.
Okay, am I on? Chris? Yeah. Are you asking me that?
I'm asking you, but I would also like to hear the thoughts of the other panelists as well, of how, what is there a line? Is there a limit that we say this is acceptable or this is not acceptable?
My worry in children's books, and I just kind of got taken on in a negative way by someone that's such a purist. I mean, I don't think he even understands the issues of censorship and intellectual freedom in children. But my issue with children is they don't have the life experience to bring to some of these issues that an adult can maybe read it and think through, even though sometimes they don't. But children especially don't. And so I am really uncomfortable, even with minor details that would make a child uncomfortable. Because especially if they're reading it independently and don't have guidance as they go.
And I would add that, you know, I don't even necessarily think it's about making a child uncomfortable, because as you said, sometimes kids don't necessarily have the world experience to understand. But what is being normalized in that book? Is it okay just to have a little picture of an African-American who looks like a monkey? Well, no, it's not. And I'm not, you know, we probably need to talk in specifics about, you know, if there are particular books, but I think the birthday cake for George Washington is probably an example. You know, a couple of pictures of happy slaves. Well, yeah, that's a problem, you know, especially given the history of what actually happened with that whole situation. So yeah, I think that heightened sensitivity to this, particularly as we become a more diverse culture, is really important, because who's to say, oh, it's, you know, this isn't that bad, but for that population, it might be that bad, right? So I think it's worth really, you know, also as much as you can, to sort of get perspectives from people who are targeted, who are represented in that text, I think is useful as well, if you can.
Yeah, I'd agree with Pat and with Michelle. I mean, even subtle versions or small versions are still versions of caricature, and they still do damage, and a subtle version can make a more overt version more acceptable. And because you are absorbing this knowledge as a child without the filters, without the perspective, as Pat says, to evaluate it, you risk internalizing an injury that you cannot articulate. And if there's an adult there to help you articulate it, well, that's one thing. But yeah, I don't really think there is a small example that is somehow okay.
Thank you all. Great thoughts. I think it takes us to a point, and Michelle, you made this so eloquently in your book, Brown Gold. I'm going to quote it if I can. It's from chapter 9. You say, regardless of how innocuous a book might seem, literature is by nature political, and the teachers and aspiring teachers among us should be ever cognizant of that fact. I would like to include library workers under that educational umbrella that you're putting up. And my question to you and the other panelists is, what tools and resources are available to library workers that allow us to stay cognizant?
Well, there are tons of blogs and webcasts and, reading while white, which I think is a great lens for many people who aren't necessarily don't have background. If you don't have a library degree, or if you do and you didn't get that background, library, I think it's called In the Library with a Lead Pipe. There are lots of online spaces now where you can learn, and sort of communities of especially white librarians who are taking it upon themselves to educate themselves, because I think one problem, just had a session with the current executive director of ALA, and one problem is folks like me and folks like her are constantly being burdened by educating white people who aren't willing to do the work themselves, and that's not acceptable. I think if you are doing the work, you are doing some reading, you are finding those podcasts that help you, listening to Isabel Wilkerson's Cast, who, when it came to what happened in January, she was like, I can imagine just like her sitting in her kitchen going, didn't I tell y'all? I told y'all this was coming, because of, all of these details that she had laid out in Cast, which is just about the, endemic nature of racism in the US and how far back it goes. It goes, pre-US, honestly. And so, I think that if you're doing the work, you're in a much better position to be able to sit down with somebody who can help you, get a little further, having discussion groups and things like that. But most people get into library work because they love to read. And so whether it's eye reading or ear reading, use that. Read Phil's book. It's very accessible. Read my book. It's, about the history of African-American children's picture books, but, and Pat. So look up the folks who are going to help you understand the things that you have gaps in. And I think that's really important.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Guy, you're still
Guy,
muted.
you're on mute.
Listening, not being a librarian, so I'm also coming with the lens of a patron, a person who's read many of these books, who's been influenced by these books just by the virtue that they're in the atmosphere. Even if you don't even read them, you just hear about them. Kind of like Phil said, you don't even know why you know it. You just know it. Michelle, when you put up your stats on what characters are in the books, and then you go to what authors are being published, and then you also juxtapose that by the populations within the United States. the challenge that I see is how do we, the books that eventually get into the library, there's a system that gets the books into the library. So even though, let's say that the people of color, their numbers rise in the population, but the people who are the owners of the companies, the Macmillans and the Harbrace and all of those, if they remain the same, I wonder how does that change? And since this is kind of new to me, I haven't really shaped that question. But when I think about it, the power structure part doesn't change, even though the population, and then there's also that sentiment, people of color, they don't really read, so they might not be our target audience. So I hope I'm not derailing us, but in that information just brought that to me. I just thought maybe there's probably for non-librarians who are sitting on the call, they might be saying, yeah, how do we get our books and these images into our children's and hands?
Yeah, they also said Black people don't watch movies. What happened with Black Panther? Hello, you give them something they want to watch, they're going to come, right? So same thing with the book industry. But I will say that, a few years ago, a survey was taken of who is reviewing the books and wanting the review services to make that a lot more transparent, because those pipelines they found for those who answered were something like 80% white, which librarianship is about 80% white. So, so you're right. And if you can probably count on 1.5 hands the number of executives, who are in the children's book industry. And Andrea Davis Pinkney, is one of the few. And we need things like internships to bring, BIPOC students into those spaces and whatnot. But you hit on a big, yes, those power structures and the whiteness of the industry writ large, from illustrators, authors, publishers, agents, all of that. Yes.
Yeah, and the internships need to be paid. There's a real pipeline problem in the publishing industry that you're not getting the people into the industry who would diversify the industry because of the barriers of getting into the industry that, I don't know, maybe they don't have generational wealth. I don't know. There are certain groups that's more true of. I can't think off the top of my head who those be. I'm being slightly sarcastic there, but there's a number of structures that actively prevent the diversification of publishing that publishing has to address structurally. It can't just sort of be a few good intentioned folks within the system. And to answer Chris's original question, following the Seuss controversy, I assembled a whole bunch of resources. I've just dropped that in the chat here for folks who are interested in anti-racist children's literature. Since Michelle mentioned a podcast, I think Code Switch is a podcast that, if you would like to be more literate, if you would like to be more racially literate, that's just a good one to listen to because it's always good. So, but yes.
Thank you all. We are running close on time, so I'll end with one more question before we switch over to the group Q&A. And Pat, you brought this up early on, and I think it's something that we need to focus on. Libraries maintain strict policies for the removal of outdated nonfiction materials. It's dangerous for us to keep a medical book that is from 50 years ago because of the information. These policies blur when it comes to fiction, if they exist at all. What responsibility do library workers have to maintain classical fiction titles on our shelves?
Well, that's their question I got recently for School Library Journal, where a guy took me on when I said that it may be time to retire some to the archives, or depending on the mission of your library, because children's collections and school libraries are not archives for the most part. I would have no problem in following the guidelines outlined, for deselecting a book and moving them somewhere else, or because of all the reasons that we've just discussed on how children react to the books. And it may not even be things that are culturally it may be just things that we read as a child. No child wants to read today necessarily because, childhood has changed so much. And, but unfortunately, there are parents that still ask for those books because that's what they remember from their childhood and that's all they know. So they want to give them to their kids. So our role is to move them forward and to lead them to other things. So I would say that some of the classics, and I've had a lot of questions in regard to Old Newberry and Caldecott books that are no longer read. Some are not even in print anymore for some of because they're weren't selling and they moved them on out. So I think we have to be willing to let go when they don't fit the demands of our patrons or fit the mission statement of what we're trying to do to educate the public. And I mean, I think we have to define a classic, too, because, classics as we grew up knowing them may be very different from what we would define as a classic now. I mean, the Seuss books are certainly classics, although, some people wouldn't call them that, but they really are because look how long they've lived on. So I think we just have to follow our policy, look at your overall collection development guidelines and make sure you follow them to a T and be willing to move them on out. And one of the things is usage, and demand from the public. And if it hasn't been used or demanded in a long time too, be willing to move it on out.
We have about 2 minutes or so before we end. So I just asked if there are any other final thoughts before we go into the staff Q&A.
I did just want to add, I think probably I didn't answer the question that you asked me to answer, Chris, and it was about how to evaluate, contemporary children's books. And there are lots of resources out there for that as well. But looking for things like, is a Latinx family represented with a lot of different skin tones and, facial features and whatnot, or do they look like cookie cutter? Is it sort of Barbie with different colored or not with different colored skin? Sometimes it happens. And so looking at things like that, especially looking at who wrote it, when they wrote it, to Pat's point about sometimes it's time to retire things. And, quite honestly, like Ezra Jack Keats, I was in graduate school before I realized that Keats wasn't Black. I just thought anybody writing this much about Black kids must be Black, but I didn't know. And the fact that he really took time and spent, energy and in some ways sacrificed things because he got beaten up a bit in the the industry for being out of his lane in some ways, but he just committed to, when he decided to do Peter and the Snowy Days, like, I grew up with these kids in Bedford-Stuy. I want to write about them. I want to illustrate them, and nobody's doing that. So I'm going to do that. And so even though he's not an Own Voices writer, I think he really did his homework in a lot of ways. And so I share those books. There are other books, though, that I don't share because actually somebody, I was doing an interview about the whole Seuss thing, and somebody asked me, I have a nonprofit, Read-A-Rama, and it's based on using children's books as a springboard for all the other activities. And somebody said, well, how would you share a Seuss book in Read-A-Rama? I was like, why would I do that? I'm spending my time on BIPOC books that they won't find on their own, right? So like 90% of the books that we've read with the kids in our story times since last March, we started in mid-March last year doing weekly story times, have been BIPOC books. We've done, we had Kelly Starling Lyons a few weeks ago. Why am I going to spend my time exposing them to things? They're going to find Beverly Cleary's work. I am confident about that. They're going to find Seuss. There's a whole lot of stuff that they're going to find. They're going to find Silverstein. I don't necessarily have to push those books. It's the Zetta Elliott books that I want them to find. Now that she's, won a Caldecott honor, I'm confident that they will. A place of inside of me just won the Caldecott honor. But, I just think I'm not going to spend my time and energy putting time into teaching books in my classes that are a part of the canon that they're going to find anyway. I can hand them one volume and they can get the white history of children's literature from Peter Hunt. Whereas the history I'm going to give them of African-American children's literature, they're not getting anywhere else because I'm the specialist in that, especially picture books. So that's just to say, when you're looking at evaluating children's literature, do a little bit of homework to find out what perspective it's coming from, because that will tell you a good bit. Okay.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all of our panelists and everyone who has tuned in from YouTube to watch this discussion. I hope the conversation has encouraged you to consider new points of view within this topic, and I look forward to discussing them with you when we can all meet in person. Again, please consider subscribing and liking the channel to be notified for new content from the Free Library of Philadelphia's Special Collections Division.